This is Edward Siegel. Welcome to the Crisis Ahead podcast. Each week, we look at how companies, organizations, and individuals in the news are responding to, managing, or recovering from a crisis, and what you can learn from their successes or failures. My observations and recommendations are based on my experience managing crisis situations and advising others on how to respond to and bounce back from disasters, scandals, and other emergencies. Welcome back to the Crisis Ahead podcast. My guest today is Jill Greenberg, the spokesperson and public information officer for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, who will talk about some of the crisis situations she's worked on. They include the recent failure of 2 dams, a toxic green ooze that leaked onto a major highway in Detroit, and more. But first, here's my take on how companies in the news are handling their crisis situations. A best practice for responding to a crisis is that as soon as you see or hear there's a problem, don't wait to do something about it. In the past few weeks, we've seen examples of companies and organizations that have taken decades to do something about racism, racist policies, and racist practices. For any organization to deny that they knew that these problems existed would be to admit that they had been blind and deaf to the realities swirling around them. What's worse, to admit that you knew there were problems but did nothing about them, or to say you did not do enough to address the problems? Or should you confess that you did not even know there were problems? No matter how you answer, unless you immediately deal with urgent issues and challenges today, you run the risk of causing or contributing to a crisis tomorrow. Quaker Oats finally got around to doing the right thing recently when they said they will change the name and logo of their Aunt Jemima pancake and syrup brand. A spokesperson for Quaker Foods North America said they recognize that Aunt Jemima's origins are based on a racial stereotype. They admitted that their efforts over the years to update the brand had fallen short of the mark. That announcement was followed by one from Mars, the company behind the Uncle Ben's brand of rice. Mars said that the Uncle Ben character, which represents a racial stereotype, would disappear. In a statement, the company said that, quote, "Now is the right time to evolve the brand. We don't yet know what the exact changes or timing will be, but we are evaluating all possibilities," unquote. Why did Mars think that this was the right time to do the right thing? Perhaps the answer can be found in the recent civil unrest and protests against racism, racist policies, and racist practices that followed the murder of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis. It's unfortunate but true that companies sometimes have to be encouraged or pushed to do the right thing. How about your organization? What issues or problems need to be addressed and resolved? And why haven't they done something about them? What are they waiting for? Companies that wait too long to do the right thing run the risk of creating their own crisis. My advice as a crisis management expert is this: don't wait. As soon as you know there is a problem, do something about it. I've written a new book that provides additional advice on how you can prevent, manage, and recover from a crisis. Crisis Ahead: 101 Ways to Prepare for and Bounce Back from Disasters, Scandals, and Other Emergencies. Crisis Ahead is now available as a paperback book wherever books are sold and as an ebook from Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Crisis Ahead is filled with case studies about how companies and public figures have prepared for and handled crisis situations. The book also includes checklists and exercises to help you get ready for and react to a crisis. You can learn more about the book at publicrelations.com. It's not too early to start preparing for the next crisis. That's because history shows there is always a next crisis, and the sooner you are ready for it, the better. My guest today is Jill Greenberg, the spokesperson and public information officer for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. Her department has been in the forefront of several crisis situations, including the Flint water crisis and the recent failure of 2 dams. Jill recently handled the messaging for a significant hazardous contamination issue in metropolitan Detroit that involved a green ooze that leaked onto a major freeway. Welcome, Jill, to the Crisis Ahead podcast. You and your department have certainly been in the middle of some high-profile crisis situations. Which ones have been the most challenging for you, and why?
Thanks for having me. I think each crisis is really unique. And the one that was the crisis that just kept on giving was the Green Ooze situation. It seemed like a really straightforward contamination issue, and when I got in there, it was much bigger than that. It involved a plating facility that leaked hexavalent chromium. If you've heard of Aaron Brockovich, that's the same chemical, and the community was on high alert. They didn't trust our department. We had been renamed to Eagle, but they remembered DEQ, and there was a significant lack of trust, primarily from the Flint water crisis. So I went in having to learn a lot about the situation fast, and I had to communicate with the media that was frankly wary of our department, even though I had worked with them professionally a few years back and knew them one on one.
So, how is the Green Ooze crisis resolved?
Yes, well, the site was a historically contaminated site. It had been shut down by our department 3 years prior. There was a lot of concern because it was in a residential area. We quickly ruled out any contamination to drinking water. It was municipal water. There were no wells in the area. Still, it was an eyesore, and people were very frightened by the possibility of air, touch contaminants. Um, so, so we immediately triaged the situation, figured out the owner had been dumping these highly toxic chemicals into a hole in the ground underneath. It was pretty awful. So we figured out that the only way that we'd get to the bottom of this contamination was to remove the building, which was involved with the city. They were trying to remove it. Um, but we had to, do some, triage to it. But from a PR standpoint, I had to reach out to the media and do some. I had to get them to trust me, basically, and so what I did is I just happened to be in town when this happened. I took calls. I created a quick email list of all the media that was contacting me, and I sent out like numerous updates throughout the day that they could just run with. From a department that really lacked in transparency in the past, that it was unprecedented. And within 48 hours, I was on CNN talking about this issue. So it was a real high profile way to say, hey, we see this. This is scary. We're on it. We're gonna stay on it. And health and environmental safety is at the top of our concerns. Um, what happened is, secondarily, there were other issues that came out of this, that um, people want to know, why wasn't this cleaned up if you knew it was shut down 3 years ago? And, it was complicated. The EPA did a time critical removal of just the imminently hazardous stuff, but then it was returned to us. And then I had to do some hard messaging. This really was having to explain that. It came back to us and it went into a list of thousands of contaminated sites that we didn't have the ability or finances to clean up. So we did the unexpected. We created a timeline outlining all the actions going back 25 years. There was a quarter century of decision making that really led to this moment, and that we were putting it up on a website, we were sending it out, hand delivering it. Um, the media, they just couldn't believe it, and they started trusting me and coming to me for updates. Um, so the lesson in this was, I had a professor, journalism professor, a long time ago, saying the truth is your best defense. And in this case, it really diffused a lot of anxiety and distrust in the community. Also, I stayed and I embedded myself for 5 weeks, and that seeing my friendly, familiar face helped. Um, and so this also it provided a platform toward change. So it started out as this green ooze on the freeway, which was frightening, but the global response really was that our director was able to testify before the House Appropriations Committee for more funding. When we pulled out the files on this, they were literal paper files. So there was no way to know that this, no way to cross-reference this. And there's thousands of sites that are still out there like this. So, we're working on getting the funding that we need, to bring us, kind of into the 21st century, and monitoring these things.
Where do things stand today with your relations with news organizations?
Well, the feedback's been great. there was a town hall I went to, and someone pulled me aside for a quick television interview, and and they said, "Well, we've heard good stuff about you. We've heard that you're accessible and that you'll talk in a car." I've pulled over at a rest stop just so I could talk to people. I've done cameos like in a hotel parking lot from where I was staying. So that accessibility has been really it's been important, and that they can trust me. Just the other day, I had someone call and say, "Hey, what do you know?" And it's like I said, it's a story that's got legs. The demolition was approved. The guy that owned it went to federal prison, was just released a week ago because of COVID situations. So it's a really interesting story to keep my fingers on, and the media really they really like it. And what one other thing that happened when I was at the site, I set up a tour. It was a day-long instant accessibility tour where people could come in, the media could look at where the facility was, how it went under the exit ramp and then down this hill and popped out on the freeway. So they could get a sense of the story that they were covering. And one of the media members said, we've never had this level of accessibility from your department before. And I thought, bingo, this is the right direction. And I know because they keep on calling me, even just to fish, that they trust me.
What are the lessons others can learn from your experiences with this crisis?
Well, I think accessibility was like number one. And I know it's hard to take a call at 2 in the morning or to 1 at 5 in the morning. And it was exhausting. But for me, I had to do it. I had to make sure that I was someone that they could talk to, they could get a nugget, and that they could rely on. And also avoiding the no comment, that I know that's just so tempting, especially when you don't know, or maybe it's legal. And I find that it's best to give something, to say, well, I don't know. Let me look into that and I'll get back to you. And then the case you have to get back with that reporter. That really builds trust. And if it's something legal, you can say, I can't talk on that right now, but when it's settled, I'll be available for you then. I think that there's a real fear of the unknown. And especially in our situation, we were really kind of like, you know, we really were taking our lumps, and before I came on, before we were restructured. Um, and the key for us was to just be available and to talk. Those timelines were really great. Um, Another thing is, to be willing to stand in an uncomfortable truth. I had to do that with the story a lot, especially when the press wanted to know, why wasn't this cleaned up? And I didn't know. And I went back, and we as a team looked at it, and we realized, well, this wasn't just a simple answer. This went back under a lot of, state leadership, director leadership. And to go back and say that is, I wouldn't lie if I wasn't sweating a little bit. And I had one of those, those really pit bull type reporters that sat me down, and I didn't know he was going to go at me like that. And he wanted to know, and he wanted to know. And I came out with that. This is something that we found out we're willing to look at. And this is hard. This is a hard truth of ours that we have to own, and we want to make it better. And it diffused him so quickly. I was really surprised by that. And since then, he's actually reached out to me and asked if I had any tips. And he's not known to be a really friendly fella. So that really worked out for me.
A more recent crisis was the failure of not one, but two dams in the state. What were the issues and challenges you had to deal with in those crisis situations?
Well, this is an interesting crisis in that it was massive. It is massive. It was a flood that impacted 70 miles of a river, put downtown Midland under 9 feet of water. I mean, it truly was catastrophic. And when I started at Eagle, I was the only public information officer. And in the last year, we've gone from that to a comms manager and 3 PIOs. So the luxury of that was that we were able to jump in and really take this issue on. And really also, while we're in a part layoff, we're only working 4 days a week. So we had to stretch our resources thin. And my colleagues did the initial crisis messaging that this was happening, what was going on. And I was able to look at it from an environmental scanning point of view, which I think is just really critical with crisis work as well. I was able to sit back and say, well, what really needs to be looked at, and I was seeing just like devastation, and I was thinking about the solid waste impact. We had a similar like unusual flooding in Detroit years back, and it just really overwhelmed our landfills. And so I was thinking about that, and reached out to communities and Eagle. And we came up with some general guidelines on residents and businesses who were coming back to their properties, and what they should know, how to keep themselves safe, how to minimize the impact upon the environment. So really, that came down to giving tips about, sorting through your refuse, finding out, what is recyclable, even like a washing machine, and what is a hazardous waste, where does that go to safely for disposal, and minimizing that solid waste that really was headed toward already stressed landfills. So that really seemed to be helpful messaging that was picked up really at a state level, that definitely was helping out for that. But we also have a high water crisis in Michigan, where there's just a lot of flooding throughout the state. So it was information that really was statewide very helpful.
Of course, another crisis your department worked on was the Flint water crisis, but that earlier crisis has been back in the news because of the pandemic. Tell us about that.
Well, most recently with the COVID-19, I've been involved in an executive order from Governor Whitmer that ordered all homes without water to be reconnected. So I've been working with our environmental justice advocate and our clean water advocate to do outreach to communities that historically are impacted by um, these sort of lack of access to water. Um, and in COVID, it was extraordinarily important to turn this water on, because the first line of defense, on protecting yourself from COVID is washing your hands with soap and water for up to 20 seconds. So if you're living in a home, you've got children with you, and you don't have running water, how do you do the most basic thing to protect yourself and your family? So what I ended up doing is, it was kind of like basic research on what communication vehicles, radio, uh, television, newspapers, web, that really like spoke to populations that were affected by water turnoffs. So this was not the mainstream newspapers. I mean, these communities were probably not going to be going there. They were going to their community information portals. And it was also important to work with these communities, because the government at times can be a distrusted entity. So to have messaging come through community outlets is very helpful. So that's just one example of some of the messaging that I've been doing there.
One of your responsibilities is to serve as FEMA's spokesperson in the event of a nuclear or radiological incident. What kind of training have you received that would help you to manage those kinds of crisis situations?
That is true. We had in the Lower Peninsula, we have two like radiological facilities, and one of them I went to last year and did several weeks of training, where it was from the very basic of being in the emergency operating center, information's coming in. It was a run through emergency exercise, and so we would get the information the press release would be written, but then I would go into a room and we had local press come in and ask questions based on the emerging nature of the emergency. So it was changing, and it would escalate, and it would go from an issue to a state emergency, and which access different levels of state and federal funding. And it was a great experience for me because I saw the varying ways that an emergency like that would impact, from policing to agriculture and farming and residences and evacuations, and having clear, consistent messaging was helpful because the press would push and push, and they'd really ask all kinds of questions, and to be able to go in, have that, and then, like I said earlier, to say, that's a great question. I'm going to have to go back to the emergency operating room and get you more information. And then, like 5 minutes later, I'd be out there with a slip of paper that I could give them. So it was helpful for me to also understand the whole process, because I wasn't really aware of it before I started, and just how they test for radiation and the new technology. They, up till now, they've been having, the theory is like a truck would go back and forth with Geiger to test. And now they're testing, drones and exposure rates there, where it's less impact to human health.
Well, I'm sure we all hope that you never have to put that training to use.
Well, I hope so too, but I will be ready if that happens.
Thanks again, Jill, for joining us. My guest today was Jill Greenberg, the spokesperson and public information officer for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Crisis Ahead podcast. Remember, it's not a matter of if companies and organizations will have a crisis, but when.